Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this week's version of News Digest from the Masters of Supply Chain. I'm John Church, and I'm joined today by my new friend, Matt Spooner, who brings a long history and a level of expertise in finance and supply chain from companies like Ericsson, ABB. I know, Matt, you also worked at Gartner for a while doing some research, and now are in advisory kinds of roles. We have on this segment spent a lot of time in the last month talking about tariffs and discussions around what does this mean? Does it trigger reshoring if you're in the United States? How will U.S. companies sort of maintain their earnings profile and their profit margins as they look at taking on new tariffs? And how would you pass that on to consumers? We've talked about the idea that as other countries reciprocate and retaliate, how does that change the market perspective, and how do you look at it? But it's really been very U.S. centric, and to be honest, it's been very sort of defensive in nature. How do we protect what we had historically and deal with this new situation? And I'm interested in getting your perspective, Matt. You're based in Zug, Switzerland. What are you seeing? And I think you're a Brit by background, yes. And so you might bring a very different perspective around what all of this noise, and at the time of recording here, just for everybody, I've just been informed within the last half hour that President Trump is actually pausing for 90 days to have additional talks on almost all of the reciprocal tariffs, with the exception of China, which has now been raised to, at least the last two articles I saw, 125% tariff on Chinese goods. As Mark Twain once said, if you don't like the weather, wait a couple minutes and it'll change. I think that we've been viewing the tariff situation sort of the same way. But maybe getting back to this idea of opportunity, or how are companies, and how does the playing field change for folks that aren't in the U.S., and maybe what are the ways we should think about this? When someone's playing defense, there must be someone playing offense. So how does that create opportunities, and what are you thinking about, and what are you hearing from people?
Yeah, thanks very much for the intro, John. And as you say, we've been talking about tariffs for the last 3 months or so, but the last week has, I think, caught everyone, slightly by surprise. And I think that probably and it's interesting what you're talking about, playing offense and playing defense. What I would say is, for an organization at the moment, the best place to be is anywhere that's not the USA. I think just because of the level of disruption that we're seeing in the US, and I think that when it is highly disruptive in Europe, and it's highly disruptive in Asia. But I think that we can see far more opportunity. I could just take maybe for one very simple example.
Mm-hmm.
If on the 1st of January, your biggest competitor trading in Asia was a US company, that competitor has pretty much vanished, and now you can take the opportunity of taking all of that additional market share in Asia. So I think that there's a lot of companies in Europe are actually looking at, okay, so what does this mean for the competitive landscape? What does this mean for my supply chain network? Because I think that there are lots of opportunities. Of course, some European companies it's going to be absolutely devastating. If we hear on the news a lot here about French wine and cheese makers,
Right.
and the US being their greatest export market. There's. That's going to be, it's a tough, or the Scottish distilleries, the whiskey distilleries.
Sure.
That's going to be a really tough pill to swallow. But I think that for lots of other organizations, I think that you can see some really big opportunities. There's another impact of the tariffs, although I think it might have been lessened in the most recent announcement that's in the last half hour. But I think that if you look at, and we've both worked in global organizations for 20 years, and I think it's probably pretty safe to say that in those last 20 years, that inflation has impacted the world pretty much equally. You go through inflationary cycles, and inflation goes up everywhere at the same time, and inflation goes down,
Right.
everywhere at pretty much the same time. And I think suddenly we've decoupled that, because I think what you're going to see is a lot of inflationary pressure in the US as a result of the tariffs being put in place. And I think you're going to see a reduction in inflation particularly in Europe, where excess manufacturing capacity in China, where the Chinese manufacturers are um, looking for new markets where they've got surplus manufacturing capacity, where actually they might start reducing their prices. So you could actually see prices reduce. Hopefully, we're not going to see deflation, but I think you can see a suppression of inflation in Europe and an increase in inflation in the US. And that's not happened in my lifetime. I've been in supply chain and finance for 30 years, and that's not happened. And I mean, I was sitting here today thinking, so what are the implications of this of this happening, where you've got these two different sets of inflation happening?
Real production market shifts, different markets becoming important to different companies for the first time in a long time. Used to be simply based on where's the economic wherewithal and where's the population, where can we penetrate. Now this tariff situation and the size of the tariffs, we also haven't seen triple-digit tariffs in our lifetime. People sort of build their supply chains and their sourcing strategies based on a pretty narrow. They might do scenario planning, but a fairly narrow sort of sets of assumptions that you think might accordion back and forth, if you will. But to think about this in terms of the kinds of 0 to 125% things. It'll be interesting to see, and you and I were talking before this, there's a lot of decisions sort of held up in the boardroom right now. Am I willing to make that investment or not? Am I willing to do these kinds of things as we sort of sift through the noise? One other thing that I just occurred to me, we've talked a lot about reshoring and people trying to bring it into, at least into North America, people trying to bring production back. And at least one of the stated objectives of this tariff regime is not only what the current administration would call fairness and equity, but to sort of bring manufacturing back to the U.S. When that happens, we've been battling a labor shortage in many sectors for a long time. We don't have people to do the jobs. And if we did, one of the reasons that so many things were offshored was not only the availability of labor, but also the cost and the cost differential. What sorts of things do you see happening for a former company of yours like ABB? I mean, it strikes me that that's going to lead to a lot of automation, a lot of technology, if indeed that's going to be part of the scenario planning and scenario execution.
Yeah, and I think what you're talking about there is, the much longer term scenario. So when we typically talk about scenario planning, and the supply chain planning vendors talk about scenario planning, it's actually pretty short term. It's like,
Agreed.
if supplier A can't ship in 2 months' time, can I get it from supplier B type scenarios? And we're talking about major investment scenarios. So we're talking about a very different set of capabilities, scenario planning capabilities that I don't think really exist in the supply chain technology today. The shift towards sort of reshoring, nearshoring has already been going on for the last 6 years. It's certainly a strategy about creating resilience. I would say that certainly my conversations with people in the finance community, that maybe that's gone slightly off the boil in the last couple of years because of inflation and the more cost focus in the supply chain. I think suddenly nearshoring, reshoring is going to be go back to number one on the agenda. So I think it's going to go up the list of priorities, and it's about creating resilience, because this is just another example of the VUCA world that we're living in. And I think certainly for the next 4 years, I think we're going to see this level of constant type of disruption. If you look at a company like ABB, I think that they're in a unique and very interesting position, in that they are, ABB and the Yumi robots. They're one of the largest manufacturers of automation. They have also an industrial automation a business unit within ABB, and they are an organization who I think are probably one of the most credible in the market at the moment in automation. They also have a lot of manufacturing capability in the US as well. So I think that companies, in big industrial companies like ABB, who can provide that level of automation, are suddenly going to see a massive surge in demand as organizations do look to increase their investment in manufacturing in the US.
Do you see? So I agree with you absolutely. And again, we've approached that from how would U.S. companies reshore? take a look at all the automakers that are importing products. And yes, certainly some have moved manufacturing into the United States to build their models, but still getting lots and lots of parts from around the world and bringing it together. Do you see, and are you getting the wins of companies outside the U.S. saying, look, we're going to have to put, turn shovels and build plants, build manufacturing capability in order to service that market. We're not willing to cede that market. We're gonna build manufacturing capacity in the U.S. and figure out how to navigate it from an offensive perspective, as opposed to hoping that their main shores can import and survive the trade wars.
Yeah, I think that boardrooms across Europe and Asia that's been probably the main talk, the main conversation that's been going on this week. I'm not sure that any or many organizations are ready to pull the pin at the moment. It's just too uncertain. You've seen today, the tariffs being reduced to 10% for everyone other than China. Although there's still actually a question about, it's not entirely clear what's happening with Mexico and Canada, but so there's still a lot of lack of clarity. And I think that most organizations would probably say, with a 10% tariff, let's do much more of a wait and see strategy. The other thing, we're talking about finance. The long-term bonds in the US have crashed today. Maybe that's as a result of China offloading some of its bonds, but that makes investing in the US a lot less attractive, because you're not going to be able to borrow at favorable rates. So I think it's a really, really complex situation, and I don't think it's just looking at the headline of the tariffs. I think you've got to look at, well, can you make a good business case that is a robust business case for 5 or 10 years? Then you look at another side of things. So, and I know that President Trump talked about about Apple. Even though it's a US company, it manufactures most of its phones in China. Well, if you look at part of the reason that Apple manufactures most of its phones in China is that it's co-located with the component suppliers.
Correct.
And the vast majority of the value of an Apple phone is in the components, in the chips. So if you look at, say, a company like TSMC, maybe you can convince TSMC to invest in a new wafer fab in the US, but that will be for the next generation of chips. They would never invest in a wafer fab for an older generation of chips, because when you're manufacturing a chip, it's the upfront investment is huge, and then the marginal cost is actually very, very low. So what you need to do is recover that. So you could see, an iPhone 20 in 2 or 3 years' time with the latest generation of silicon in it. Maybe that is feasible to manufacture that in the US. But I don't think that a lot of these decisions are going to be really short-term decisions. I think that organizations are looking at, well, what does this mean in the long term? And I don't want to stray into the politics, but what does the long term mean at the moment?
Yes, and how long is long term? To your point, even if this administration stays the course, what happens in 3 years and 9 months, and the election cycle in the U.S. and what does that mean? To your point, building a business case, if you're going to actually put a shovel in the ground and do significant investment, these are 10, 15, 20-year kinds of looks. If you're going to do significant shifts to your supply chain, and maybe also to your point, even if you look to do your TSMC or your Apple and you're going to move production to the U.S., you're not going to move it to the U.S. to supply the rest of the world. You're going to do it for a 330 million person market of a 7 billion person world. It changes the economics from how you and I grew up thinking about sourcing, thinking about putting sourcing capability and manufacturing capability in places that largely was informed by a bilateral trade agreements, by free trade agreements, or at least manageable tariffs. The noise of today, the longer-term finance perspectives becomes one that certainly is giving people pause. It gives us a lot to talk about, but I don't know that we've gotten any smarter along the way. We're helping people think about maybe some of the alternatives and some of the implications, but if we had a crystal ball, we'd be doing something other than talking to each other at this time of day.
And I think there's another aspect to this as well. Probably over the last 15, 20 years, I think there's been a reduction in, true, deep level of supply chain expertise, and there's been, a lot of talk about AI and Gen AI and agentic AI and everything about how the and lights off planning and automated planning. This is the where the conversation has been going. Um, Suddenly I think a lot of companies and a lot of organizations should actually be questioning that and saying, well, do we actually need, people, supply chain leaders who have a good gut instinct about what to do in these type of environments? Because it's unprecedented, and I don't think that, I think that AI could support, but AI has never been trained to provide us with the right decisions in this with this level of, with these type of events happening.
Right. And to your point, the real upside of AI is to be able to take more complex situations and do it faster in real time with real data, and sensing and responding much quicker than humans can do. That's not what we have here. I mean, these kinds of problems can be solved on pencil and paper or in spreadsheets. The kinds of dynamics of the economics going on here aren't, I've got a truck suspended in some place, I have a ship that isn't unloaded. What do we do? How can we work through it? Can we get early warning? This is structurally, do I have the right network? And what do I want to build? We can then employ AI maybe to optimize those at the edges, but these are big decisions that don't have to be made by computers necessarily.
Absolutely. One of the fascinating things about is going to be what does this do to global supply chain networks? I think that it's actually going to start reshaping some of the global supply chain networks, and there'll be it's unpicking the networks. I mean, today, I think only 4% of organizations have visibility of their supply chain networks beyond about the tier three. I think people are going to rapidly realize that they need to have far more visibility of their supply chain networks and be far more mindful about the design of their supply chain networks, because that's that I think is really lacking in many organizations today.
Couldn't agree more. Well, Matt, thank you. We live in interesting times. It'll be interesting to see where this discussion evolves to. We'd probably have very different perspectives at the end of next week, so I look forward to continuing the discussion. If you've enjoyed the discussion today, first of all, click and subscribe. We'd love to join you weekly. If you have a comment, both you're in agreement or massive disagreement, please make sure you add that in. We read our comments and we respond to them appropriately. Thanks for your time, and Matt, I hope you have a nice evening.
Thanks very much, John. It's been great to talk to you today.
Take care.